It is obviously exciting to be here and be part of what's happening in Florida. One of the things I'd like to share today are just what I see are kind of like lids that keep us as leaders and as congregations from fulfilling kind of the full potential that God has for us as leaders and or the congregations in which we serve. And they're not in any particular order, so don't think of them as first being the most important, but rather they're just as they came to my mind as I prepared this talk. They're things that I've witnessed. And the first one is the pastor is not in his or her A game. Now, what do I mean by that? Really, I mean, everybody has an A game. Everybody has an A game. I believe God calls people, and he calls you to be in your A game. But one of the problems it is, I think, is because we've seen so much in the media, we read, we do all that stuff, we think we want an A game like this person has. I'll never forget, man, when I was, considering leaving General Motors and going to seminary, for me, I wanted to preach like Charles Swindoll. And so I did. Literally, the first sermon I preached, I just memorized it word for word, the sermon he preached. It just, and I delivered it, but it didn't come across with quite the same punch that it did in Swindoll's. Well, one of the reasons is because I wasn't in my A game. No surprise, but I'm not Swindoll. I know you guys all knew that. I didn't at the time. But I think the first thing we have to do is we have to understand the role we fill in a life cycle. And I'm going to talk about a life cycle here today, at the beginning. And I know some of this may be review for some of you. And if it is, you just mentally take a break. If it's not, I would encourage you. Helping grasp some of the concepts of a life cycle will help you figure out where is your A game. Because some of us lead better in one part of an A game or one part of a life cycle rather than another part of a life cycle. So let's talk about that. Let me suggest the church first is the body. Paul continually refers to the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians, in Romans, in Ephesians, and in Colossians, and there are other places he references the church as the body of Christ. And as a body, it's a living organism. We talk about that. We say the body is a living organism. And any living organism has health. You can measure your health as an individual, emotionally or physically or relationally, spiritually, financially. I know financially it's not been easy the last few years, but we can measure our health. And you could be really healthy in one area, physically, for instance, and terrible financially or emotionally or in another way. So as you look at your own body, you realize you can measure health in a lot of ways. But the thing to keep in mind is that everybody has elements of health and unhealth. Meaning that no one's perfectly healthy. I am physically fairly healthy, folks. I ran 6 miles yesterday. I run fairly consistently. Weights are where it should be, and all those kinds of things. But there also is unhealth in my life. If you don't know, I have prostate cancer. Now, it's not going to kill me tomorrow. I'm not panicking. But the reality is, I have to deal with that. Well, there are some elements of health. I'm really healthy in some ways, and there's some ways I'm not healthy. And it's true of all of us, by the way. So don't just think that you're a perfect specimen of health. There are elements of health and unhealth in your life. The same thing is true of a church. The church has elements of health and unhealth. You just need to ask yourself, the church that you're a part of, what are the elements of health that are here, and what are the elements of ill health, if you will, lack of health? And your health is on a continuum. It's not one way or the other, and so is that of a church. Now, there are four ways you measure health. Like I mentioned a moment ago, we can measure our health through, emotionally and relationally and physically. There are 4 ways that I would suggest fit for me in evaluating the health of a church. They're not original with me, but the first is vision. The second is relationships. In other words, as you look at the church, is it healthy in its areas of vision? There's 3 ways I look at vision. Basically, it's mission. Why does the church exist? It's vision, where you're going, and its values. Those are the 3 components, if you will, of vision. Relationships, there's at least bunches of ways, but one of the ways we say is the church healthy relationally is the people inside the body. Do we have healthy relationships inside the body? Some of our churches do. Some of our churches are having feuds going on inside their bodies. Believe me, I know. I've gotten involved in a few of those. So one way we measure health of a body is what's people happening inside. What's the organicness of our churches? Are they relating well, and are they in small groups and all those kinds of things? Do they feel cared for and nurtured and so forth? Another way of looking at relationships is, do they have healthy relationships with those outside the body, with lost people? I would suggest your church cannot be healthy if it's not engaged, if the people of the church are not engaged with lost people in healthy relationships outside the body. So there's a lot of ways we look at relationships. The health of a church can be assessed relationally. Ministries. What kind of ministries are happening in the church? Again, if you look at churches, you can have healthy ministries or you can have unhealthy. What's an unhealthy ministry? Well, it's a ministry that exists simply because we've always had that ministry. We've had it for 50 years. And we staff it with a committee every year. They plan it. They pull off some events. But, there's really no life change occur. No one comes closer to Christ. no one comes to Christ. It's just simply taking up time on the calendar. That's not a healthy ministry. So there's ministries that ways you can look at your health based on the ministries you have. And then the last way to look at the health of a church, I would suggest, is, assuming this works, structure. Is if you look at that structure of your church, and we'll get into this in a moment, but I would posit for you that the structure of your church should build up the other three, not vice versa. See, a number of our congregations that I have visited, not only in Florida, but in other places as well, really the problem is that the structure is inhibiting vision, relationships, healthy relationships, and ministries rather than supporting them. And so the structure is not a health aspect of that congregation. So there's four ways that I would suggest we can look at that. Now, another interesting thing for me about life cycles is as humans, we have life cycles. We have multiple life cycles. For instance, the first 25 years of your life is a life cycle for the most part. What I mean by life cycle is there's an organizing principle around which you form. And your first 25 years, the organizing principle is all about growing up. I mean, let's face it, for some of us, we never grew up, but by the time you're 20 or 25, you've achieved some modicum of health or maturity. But then you enter another stage, if you will, of life, another life cycle. And that second life cycle, as I show here, I've called it the maturing years. You often have children during those years. You may or may not, but often we get married and you have kids and you raise those kids. And you find that whereas the first 25 years was all about you growing up, that was the organizing principle. Second 25 years is all about your kids, giving it away and investing in your kids. It's a whole other organizing principle, and your whole life has changed that second life cycle. Then you have a third life cycle, and hopefully it's an empty nest. Some of us find kids keep coming home, and our parents. But anyways, it's a wisdom years. It's the years where scripturally probably should be the most productive years of your life, which is unfortunate because we have so many people who retire in their 50s. And according to God's economy, that's the wisdom years. And that's a whole other life cycle. It's all about God having produced wisdom in those first two life cycles that you then use for the kingdom in the third life cycle. And the last life cycle I've simply called the afterglow years. You can figure that out. But it's whatever. It's another season of life. It's another season of life. So that we have multiple life cycles, and so do churches actually. Churches have life cycles that span about 20 to 30 years. As I look at a lot of congregations, this is not original with me again, but they used to say 20 years. I say it's between 20 and 30 years is an average life cycle of a church. An average life cycle of a church. And what I mean by that is there's an organizing principle around which that whole church operates for those 20 or 25 years. Now, what I know and what I've learned from life cycles is churches that are growing, going up that left-hand side of the life cycle, churches that are really growing and going when a church gets started or they've started a new life cycle. It may have been around for 40 or 50 years, but they're starting a new life cycle. There's usually an interesting thing. It's usually driven by vision. Vision is in the driver's seat. And it's really exciting because there's a compelling reason for that church to exist, and this is why we're going, and everybody's getting on board, and everybody's excited about the church. And we know everybody's excited because relationships follow that vision very carefully. You see, if it's just vision, if it's just, this is where we're going, folks, and there's nobody joining, that's a dream. I mean, you're fantasizing there. It only really becomes a vision when people get along beside you and say, yeah, let's go. And the people in the body get on board, and you begin to reach lost people for Christ, and the church begins to transform its community for Christ. And that church is taking off. As it does that, relationships become healthy, and then ministries have to develop, because if the church is going to truly impact that community and build disciples, you have to have certain kinds of ministries that have to happen. So ministries develop. And then and the last part of that, and we'll look at it scripturally in a moment, you see structure. That eventually there needs to be structure. Now, it is always in that sequence, folks. And whenever I visit a church, and it's on the backside of life cycle, I can usually tell. Because you want to guess what's in the driver's seat? Structure. Yeah, structure's driving the thing. In fact, I'm telling you, when I deal with churches, not here in Florida, of course, but when I deal with churches elsewhere, it's easier to change what the Bible says than to change their bylaws. I'm dead serious. I mean, these people, you cannot change the bylaws of the churches on the backside of life cycle because it is structure that's driving that church. And that's what's holding us together, folks. It's that structure. I dealt with one church, not one of our churches, of course, but I dealt with one church that literally had 36 people in the church attending on the Sunday morning service. And they had 38 committees. This is not a lie. 38 committees they were trying to staff on those things, folks. And that's what's in the second seat is the ministries. They're trying to keep things going. Structure is driving this thing. We got to keep the structure together, and we got to keep these ministries because we've always done it that way. And then what's in the back seat is really relationships. They have very few relationships, healthy relationships with lost people in the world, and in fact, the relationships inside the church are pretty dysfunctional, enabling kind of relationships, and there is no vision. And then where there's no vision, the church perishes. Now, it's interesting as you look at the life cycle of a church in a little more detail than what I just showed you. Looking at it from those four different perspectives, you'll see that there's the vision, and there's where are we going, relationships, who's going with us, ministry, how do we get there, and structure, what do we control. And you look at, I just abbreviated the life cycle and put it into these 5 or 7 different categories, from birth, childhood, adolescence, maturity, empty nest, old age, and death. If you look at that, it's really interesting that it always starts with a vision. And if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to Acts. We're going to just do a quick biblical survey of the first century church and to see how it went through these same things. And why this is really important, because as I think you'll see, it's very helpful to understand as a church, where are you in this life cycle? Because the key is, for you as a leader, you will lead differently. And some of you have your A game is back here. Some of your A game is up here. To be very candid, I know where my A game is, folks. My A game is right here. Don't put me in a church that has this, or any organization that's here. I will die. So this all fits under this rubric of knowing your A game as a leader. But it starts with a vision. In Acts 1:8, Jesus has called the disciples together. He's about ready to take off, and he says, okay, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses where? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. He gives them, this is it, folks. You're to be my witnesses. Go do it in Jerusalem. So they go back to Jerusalem, Acts 2, and man, some great things happen. People come to Christ as the day of Pentecost happens. Some great things happen, and all of a sudden we're told in Acts 2:42 through 47 that they did everything together. We're told 5 times in those 5 verses, by the way, in Acts 2:42 through 47, that they did things together. They ate bread together. They studied the apostles' teachings together. They shared meals together. They did things together. And we're also told, in that same context there, that there a number of priests and Pharisees, they had healthy relationships. They had good reputations with people in Jerusalem. They had good reputation with people in Jerusalem. They had good relationships with people outside the church. They had good relationships with people inside the church. And that's what happens. The church started with this clear vision in Acts 1:8. Acts 2 shows that the church begins to grow. What happens in Acts, if you keep reading, it's Acts 4, I think it is where we're told that the people sold all their possessions and gave to everyone who had need. And a lot of times we read that and we think, oh yeah, they gave to people in the church that had need. That's not what that says. It says they gave to everyone in Jerusalem who had need. You see, there was a ministry there of serving the poor, the underserved. They started very much, that's one of the first ministries you see there in the church, actually, is where they start that. Now we read in Acts 6, there's a ministry to widows, they have another ministry to widows and so forth. So ministries began to develop in Acts 4, and the church is flourishing. Thousands of people are coming to Christ. Disciples are being made, and ministries are springing up in the church. And if you keep reading, Acts 6:1, it's great. I mean, by now the church has been around, by the way, for 8 to 10 years, scholars tell us, by the time you reach Acts 6. And all of a sudden, we're told, and the Hellenistic widows, the widows of Greek descent, began to complain. Now, I love this passage because it's not like, oh, they began to complain and the apostles say, oh, okay, it says in Colossians that you're just supposed to do everything without complaining, so shut up and sit down and stop complaining. They didn't say that because Colossians hadn't been written yet. But the reality is the people were complaining, and the apostles said, you know what? There's some credibility. There's some reason why they're complaining, and the reason they're complaining is because we don't have structure. And so what you see in Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, is they begin to develop structure for the first time in the church. You notice there was no structure before this. There was a group of apostles that Jesus had commanded from the beginning, but this is the first time now we're 8 to 10 years into the process. All of a sudden there's structure being developed. Why? Because structure was needed to support the ministries, the relationships, and the vision, to fulfill the vision. So all of a sudden now there's structure in the church. So we see what happens. And by the way, if you keep reading, it's amazing because 2 chapters later, Acts 8:1, we're told, and a great persecution broke out against the church. And the disciples were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. The first time those two words have been used since Jesus gave them that vision. By the way, at this point, it's been 10 to 15 years. So 10 to 15 years into the life cycle of the church, all of a sudden God says, I'm not saying God caused the persecution, but God says in the midst of this persecution, okay, guys, it's time to move. And people move out, and all of a sudden, the church starts a second life cycle. First life cycle, first half of the life cycle here, was in Jerusalem. Second life cycle begins outside of Jerusalem. It starts out in Judea and Samaria. And it covers the next 5 chapters or so. Tell you about, you get to Acts 13. You see what they're doing is they're building churches outside of Jerusalem. And so what happens to the church in Jerusalem? Are they pumped? Yeah, they're excited. What happens? Paul comes to Christ in Acts 9, the very next chapter. And God always, by the way, provides leaders for life cycles. He always provides the leaders for the next life cycle. One of the frustrations is you may be the leader for the next life cycle, not the present life cycle. And there's a lot of chafing that occurs there. That's why I was saying earlier about that. You got to understand your A game. Paul's A game was not here in the first life cycle. It was the second life cycle. And so what happens in Acts 9, Paul comes to Christ, and what do? They send him to Tarsus. They send him home. If you read that passage, he goes to Jerusalem, and they finally accept him, and he causes such a stir in Jerusalem, they finally say, Paul, go home. And the passage there in Acts 9 is classic. It says, and after they sent Paul home, the church enjoyed peace, and the church grew in numbers and in the Holy Spirit. Hello, how would you like that being said about you when you leave, But that's exactly what happened. So Paul was the second life cycle leader. He wasn't that first life cycle leader. So Acts 10 comes up, and Peter gets this vision. Remember, Peter, he's sleeping, and in the middle of the dream, middle of sleep, God says, here's these animals, eat. And Peter says, man, I'm kosher, man. I don't eat that stuff. And he says, he brings out a second time, a third time, and finally, Peter wakes up, and God says the third time, Peter, what I give you, you eat. In other words, don't worry about your traditional values in that sense. And so what happens is that as he wakes up, Cornelius had sent some people. Peter was in Joppa, by the way, and Cornelius was out in Samaria. That's this Samaria thing comes up. Cornelius is out in Samaria, and so Pete goes out and he goes visits Cornelius, and you know the story. He leads the family to Christ, and everybody comes to Christ, and they're baptized, and Peter comes back to Jerusalem, and people are excited, right? No. If you read in Acts 11 what happens when he gets back to Jerusalem, we're told there was a sharp dispute. They argued. Here's Pete, man. He's supposedly the beginning of the papacy, here's the guy he's the father of the church, if you will, upon the rock that Jesus was going to build a church. And he took the church out to this new life cycle, out to Samaria. And he comes back to the church of Jerusalem, and they're ticked off. They are ticked off. And we're told a sharp disagreement breaks out, and you read Acts 11. It was only when Peter says, and he says to them, and they received the Holy Spirit just like we did. It was only when he says that they say, all right, we'll give in on this. But the reality is the church seldom accepts a second life cycle. It almost always wants to go down. I'll get to that in a minute. So what happens? The second life cycle begins, and they see churches in Antioch. It's great. In Antioch, they send Barnabas out there, who's a good Jewish boy, and he goes to Antioch, and there's this bunch of Greeks who are coming to Christ, and Barnabas gets there in Acts 11. He doesn't know what to do with these people. And so what does he do? He says, oh, remember that guy who came to Christ? Saul, who's now in Tarsus. Let me go get him. And so in Acts 11:25, Barnabas leaves Antioch, and he goes to get Saul in Tarsus, and he brings Saul back. And Saul then begins to experience his A game. You see, Paul begins to be the leader of that second life cycle. And so neat, the church in Antioch flourishes, and other churches there in Samaria take off, and they're in this second life cycle. And then they come to Acts 13:1. And in Acts 13:1, they're having an elders meeting, and they're praying, and they're fasting, I might add. And God says to the elders, set me apart, Paul and Barnabas, because now it's time to go plant churches on that third life cycle, which is around the rest of the Mediterranean area. So what happens in Acts 13:1, that Paul and Barnabas go out, and they begin to start another life cycle. They start another third life cycle, planting churches. And by the way, the time period from Acts 8:1 to Acts 13:1, again, scholars will tell us it's between 10 and 15 years. So it's about half of a life cycle. And they're up here again. And so they start out again, and they go out and they plant churches. And of course the church in Jerusalem gets pumped about it, right? No, if you keep reading, in Acts 15 what happens? They call Paul back to Jerusalem. They call the Council of Jerusalem, and they're grilling Paul because all these people who are coming to Christ out there around the Mediterranean area, they don't sing hymns out of the red hymnal. No, he doesn't say that. They don't get circumcised. It's the same thing, folks. It's a cultural expression of the faith. They didn't get circumcised. And so everybody in Jerusalem's all ticked off because they're not worshiping the Lord like we did back here in Jerusalem because we were good Jews. And so they resist another move of God through another life cycle. So and I go through life cycles. In fact, what happens is that in churches, if you look, the first thing that happens is the vision falls away. Because after 10 or 15 years, the vision wears out. And so you need a new vision in a church. And for me, it's interesting. I did research. Some of you heard me share this. I did research. I hired a Warner student, and we did some research on the Church of God in Florida from 1920, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, and the year 2000. In Florida and nationally. And I had her take the top 10 churches in each of those decades, okay, of size. And it's interesting, the 90 churches nationally over those 9 decades, if you will, and the 90 churches in the state of Florida showed the same trend. Only 2 churches out of that 90 potential churches actually stayed in that list more than twice. What does that say? It simply says that what takes the church to get it effective won't keep it there. But yet we lock in. This has worked. This has been great. This is what got us here, man. This is really, really good stuff. And so we refuse to change. And we refuse to change, and the vision leaks. The vision loses and drops off, and the church begins to head down to the empty nest syndrome. It continues down. Eventually, relationships drop off because if there's no vision, people begin to bicker and begin to fight about little things. And so you're trying to keep all these ministries going and structure. And when I come in and visit churches, I will tell you very candidly that when they talk about ministries and structure, I know exactly where they are because they're right over here. Because that's all they got left. They don't have anybody coming to Christ. The baptismal waters haven't been stirred. No one's coming to Christ and being baptized. So this is the life cycle of the church. And it's interesting, if you look at the life cycle of the church, it takes a different kind of leader. It takes what I call catalytic leaders, D's and I's in the disc, if you will, if those of you have taken disc. If you've not taken disc, you can go to our website. You can take it. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything. It's called the SCID there. DISC. I turned the letters around so I wouldn't get copyright problems. It's SCID. But it takes D and I kinds of leaders to start new visions. It takes catalytic people to start new things. To launch a new life cycle takes D's and C's. Or it takes D's and I's, but it takes S's and C's to sustain it. See, everybody's needed. You just got to know where your role is. That's why you got to know where's your A game. Where's your A game? Now, I find it really interesting as I look at churches. When I see churches that are just starting out in a new life cycle, it really attracts a lot of D's. Because D's are people who are concerned about bottom line, getting stuff done. And D's get excited when a church is doing something. There's a strong vision. And so it attracts D's. And then as the church grows, as I said, healthy relationships develop. Well, I's are the kind of people that like relationships. And so I's kind of flock to the church, and both non-Christians and Christians, I might add. And so they begin to get excited. And then as the church continues to grow, it picks up some C's. And that's what I said a moment ago. You need some people to run some systems, the S's and the C's. They sustain momentum. See, D's and I's will create a lot of fluff, but there'll never be substance if you don't get some C's and S's in there. And so as the church continues to grow, you get at the full maturity of the life cycle, you get the full cadre of who are the first people that leave? D's. They drop out, man. They're gone. Because this church ain't going anywhere. And usually when you visit churches that are in this place on the life cycle, I'll tell them, describe the kind of people who have left the church. And almost unanimously, it's all D's that have left the church. They were control freaks anyways. There's always excuses that are given for why they left. But they were D's. They were D's. And then as the church continues to grow, the next people leave are the I's. Because the I's say, man, where's everybody going here? This church isn't growing, and this isn't any fun like it used to be. I's like to have a lot of fun. They're energy people. And so the I's leave. And then as the church continues to drop off, the C's are the next one to leave because you can't do church right if you don't have enough people, and all that are left is S's. One church that I did some assessment with, and I came and visited their elder board, and they were close to this stage here, actually. And I gave them all the disc. And you might be really it's interesting to note that 8 out of 10 elders were high S's. High S's. Now, S's are great people. The number of you are S's, and that's wonderful. But when you get 8 out of 10 S's on an elder board, that church ain't going anywhere. I'm telling you. S can also mean stuck. All right? It really means stability and steadiness. S's like stability and steadiness. But if you get all S's together and nobody's pushing them and nobody's driving them anywhere, they just get stuck. Okay? So it's an interesting thing as you study your A game. Everybody, all of you have an A game. You just got to know where your A game is. And depending on where you are in the life cycle, depends where your A game and how you can best live your A game. And it's one of the reasons I see churches that really struggle is because the pastor doesn't know his A game or her A game. And it often is in reference to the life cycle. Another interesting way to measure your A game is what I call capacity. Jesus gives several parables in the scripture that talk about leadership. And he talks about 1 talent, 3 talent, the 5 talent people. And he says, what do they do with their talents? He criticizes the 1 talent person because they just buried it. And they didn't use it, mature it, invest it, and so forth. Jesus says there are different kinds of leaders. And another place he talks about producing fruit 30 and 60 and 100-fold. We'll produce fruit in different ways, folks. And here's a problem we have in our culture. Because of media and because of books and because of speakers and conferences, we all want to be that 100-fold kind of person or that 5-talent kind of leader. But the reality is we're not. We're not. And I think it's helpful to us to understand that. It's helpful for each of us to understand that. And in this little diagram that actually John Cotter developed a little bit of this at Harvard, and he said, his observation that runs very parallel with what I've seen in churches is that 10 to 15% of the leaders today fall into this category. That they're what we call 1-talent kind of leaders. He's not a Christian, so I don't think he is. So he wouldn't call it 1-talent leader, but it would fall in that category. But 75% to 80% are what I would call 3-talent leaders. 3-talent leaders, okay? And you got another 10 or 15% who are 5-talent leaders or 100-fold kind of leaders. That's reality, folks. That's how Jesus has wired us. That's our capacity. Nothing wrong with that. Now, interesting thing. I used to think I was one of these down here. I now decide I'm one of these. And that's okay. That's okay because it's an interesting thing. When you look at how people develop and how they mature, 33% of their potential, if you will, is natural. In other words, they will develop about a third of their potential by just their own natural gifts, using what they naturally got. And if you're a 1-talent person, that's not a whole lot compared to some of the others. But if you're resourced, if you are given books, and if you're people who love you and you're part of a cluster, as we've talked about in the past, or you have friends who encourage you, who challenge you, if you grow and read and all those kind of things, you can accomplish about 2/3 of your potential. You continue that. And then you can actually accomplish 100% of your potential if you're coached. If there is someone who loves you enough to speak the hard words into your life, who loves you enough to say, Greg, as one did to me one time, a coach, Greg, in that meeting, how do you think you did? I said, well, I thought I did really well, that I was the chairman of, as the pastor. And he said, you know what? I think you blew it. Why would you say that? Well, he said, every time someone had an idea, you grabbed that idea and went, and threw it out. If you didn't agree with it, you shook all the air out of that idea and you threw it away. And you did that every time someone brought an idea up. Now, I tell you, this was a guy on the board, and he was my friend, I thought, and he tells me this. And boy, but the reality is he became, for the next year and a half, the best coach and gave me the best feedback. That was, by the way, the first board meeting I ever led, I might add, when he gave me that feedback. But, he was a tremendous coach for me. And he helped me grow because he loved me enough to say the hard things to me. And that's what a coach is, by the way. A coach isn't one who just speaks fluff into your ears. A coach is one who really says the hard things that no one else could say. So, that's the 1-talent leader. But again, most of us are in the second category. There are some of us here in the third, but most of us are in the second category. And you can see as you go up the list, you can accomplish so much more as you work not only through your natural abilities, but also your resource and then your coaching abilities. Most of you read this a long time ago in Gordon MacDonald's book, Ordering Your Private World, if you're old enough to have read that when it first came out 20 years ago. And it's interesting because Gordon MacDonald, he says, it's an interesting, his observation was most of us who are really gifted down here in this next category, who are really gifted, find that we can accomplish so much more in our natural gifts than other people can, even resourced or even coached, that we learn in our 20s to coast on our natural abilities. Because we can accomplish so much more just our natural abilities. And MacDonald's observation is most people who are highly gifted never get beyond their natural ability. But it's these people who learn to resource and be coached can accomplish so much more than the most gifted person can in their natural ability. MacDonald's observations were, in their 30s and in their 40s, it's these people find themselves flagging behind, and often they've lost the momentum and the personal growth initiative to get back on track. But obviously there are some who are very gifted, and if they continue to be resourced, and if they continue to be coached, they can accomplish so much more in the kingdom. As I look at capacity, first of all, what I'm suggesting is maybe try to understand where are you in this. And some of you who have poor self-images will probably put yourself lower up here. Some of you who are overinflated, you haven't read Romans 12:3, you think more highly than you ought, probably will put yourself down here. It is interesting, as I watch people get older, the older they get, they tend to migrate a little bit up the scale here. The younger ones tend to come farther down the scale. But I would suggest it's helpful for you to know your A game, to know where your capacity is. I have met with pastors who I would honestly say their capacity is probably here, some of the pastors I met with, and they tell me that they won't take a church as a beginning church less than 500 to 600 people. Whoa. There's a capacity problem here. They don't understand their capacity. One of the best ways to help understand your capacity is have a coach work with you. Because I would suggest most of us will never know our capacity until we've been coached, who can speak honestly into your life. There's another way I would suggest to understand your A game. And I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I've written about this in the newsletter. And so you can get that and read those old newsletters. But I want to talk about the scope of your leadership, because each of us are gifted in some unique ways that determine our scope, the breadth of our ministry, if you will. Role was the first one, role in the life cycle. Second one was capacity, and this one is your scope. Some of us are logistical leaders. In other words, we are great in our leadership where we can focus on decisions where we have to figure out how to get resources to the soldiers in battle. Specifically, how do we keep the warriors supplied? How do we keep the people in our churches on the front lines equipped and trained, doing the work and encouraged that they need to be? Some of us are just gifted that way. And that is phenomenal, because the kingdom will never expand without logistical leaders fulfilling their role. But others of us are more tactical leaders. As we focus on leadership decisions that have more to do with how to win the battle, how are we going to have a great worship leader? How are we going to have a great worship time? How are we going to have a great small groups ministry? How are we going to have the ushers or the greeters or the assimilation kind of ministry? How we put all that together? And those are tactical leaders. And some of you here are very gifted tactically. Here, defined militaristically, it's how do we focus on leadership decisions so that we win the appropriate battles? You see, a war cannot be won unless you're getting the soldiers or supplies and keeping them encouraged and keeping them fed. But it can't be won either unless you know how to win the battles of the various battles that you're going to fight. You have to know that. But there's a third level of leadership, and it's called the strategic leaders. And again, it's just scope of leadership. And these are the ones that focus on leadership decisions that more have to do with how do we win the war. In other words, they're decisions like priorities. Where is their church going to go the next 3 to 5 years? Where are we going to spend our money? Where do we need to be dreaming? What are the kinds of ministries that we need? Forget about how do we pull off healthy ministries, or how do we develop these. I just need to figure out what are the kind of ministries we need. Those are strategic leaders. Same way, there are many churches that are not accomplishing what God has for them because they're not able to figure out how do we have an effective small group ministry, or how do we have an effective assimilation or greeters, or how do we have a phenomenal, effective worship kind of thing. Those are tactical kind of leaders, and we need those kind of leaders. And there have also been wars that have been lost because they just had poor strategy, folks. Poor strategy. And churches today also are not effective, as effective as they could be at least, because we have had poor strategy. We don't have strategic leaders. I would suggest that as the church grows, it needs all the more of these. And for instance, a single-cell church of 0 to 200, the primary mode of leadership you need in a church of that size is logistical leaders. You need people who know how to keep, because it's a single cell, we need to keep people encouraged. We need to keep people having their gifts. We need to keep people developing the kinds of things that they need to be effective in ministry. So that's the kind of leadership we need at a church of a single cell. The larger church, what we call a stretch cell, or Gary McIntosh called that a few years ago when he spoke, church of 200 to 400, they need tactically gifted leaders, but they also need logistically gifted leaders. They need tactical leaders who say, because in fact, one of the things we know is for churches to get from 200 to 400 is usually they've developed 1 or 2 signature kinds of ministries that are that church is known for. Man, they got a phenomenal children's ministry. And so because of that, there is usually a tactical leader, someone who's really gifted at developing children's ministries. And so that for a church to get from 2 to 400, we need those phenomenally gifted people to lead those ministries or those battles, if you will. But you also need someone who's logistically keeping people trained, keeping them encouraged, keeping them supplied, those kinds of things. And if you look at larger churches, multi-cell churches, which are 400 or more, they need people who strategically can say, how are we going to use the resources? What's the next step? Where are we going in this battle? But it's not just that, because in fact they need also tactical and logistical leaders. So it is interesting as you look at churches of different sizes, they require different kinds of leaders, different gifted leaders. And you're a rare bird, folks, if you can be all three. In fact, I would suggest you're probably dreaming because you think you can do all three. You can't. I happen to be a strategic leader. Is there any surprise that I really struggled in getting a church over 200? I never did when we planted. It didn't happen. I never got the church I planted over 200. Why? It's too much logistical and tactical stuff. And I would try to do it, and I could do it, but I would just burn out on the strategy, and I'd always end up dreaming in the clouds again. My board would say, "Greg, you're dreaming again." But my dreaming was a strategic kind of leadership, and because we never blew through the 200 barrier to a point where it could benefit from my style of leadership, I was really not in my A game. I really wasn't, and that's why after 14 years of that, I figured out that maybe this wasn't my A game, and that there was a real brokenness that occurred in my life as a result of that. So I would suggest you need to understand where your A game is. What's your scope of ministry? Where has God called you? And if you are logistical, you may fit very well into a larger church, but it's going to be doing the kinds of things in staff positions in a larger church. Same thing with tactical. So it's not like that you're destined to be in one size of a church or another if you're one style of leader. It's just you need to know your game in that church. A lead pastor with logistical gifts can do that in a single cell church. But if you're a logistical leader, your church will never get over 200. Why? Because when it gets over 200, you're going to get stuck in the weeds all the time. And you're never going to develop those signature kind of ministries. And when someone comes along who can really help you do that, you're probably going to be threatened by that. So just understand your A game and understand how you fit in. And that kind of leads us to the next part here is team. I would strongly suggest one of the reasons that churches really struggle in transforming communities for Christ is because the pastor doesn't lead from a team. It's not just knowing their A game. That's the first thing. But part of that is very close cousin to that, if you will, is you got to understand how pastors lead in teams. Now, most of us have operated in the Lone Ranger range. I mean, for those of you who are old enough, as I am, to remember Lone Ranger, he had this not politically correct assistant called Tonto, who was an Indian, a Native American, who did kind of the dirty work, but it was Lone Ranger who did it all. And it's interesting for me, if you've been around Christianity very long as a leader, you've realized that the model of leadership has changed dramatically from the 50s and the 60s. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the Lone Ranger worked very, very well. Our society was homogeneous, it was fairly stable, and what happened is that the pastor's primary need, as we'll look at in a moment, was shepherding and teaching, and he just did certain things, or she did certain things, and so what happened was the Lone Ranger model worked very well. But then as the church began to grow and the culture began to change, we saw the Lone Ranger didn't really work. So a lot of us who were raised in this Lone Ranger, or at least educated in this Lone Ranger mode, are really struggling now, because I'm telling you, the Lone Ranger model of leadership doesn't work in a church over about 60 or 70 right now. It doesn't work. If you want to do it all yourself, you can do very well in a church of 60 or 70. If that's where God's called you, do that then. But keep giving people away to other churches then. Here's the second model I would suggest is the boss. See, this kind of came on for those of you who are a little older, you probably won't appreciate this show. It's called The Office. But Michael here, working for Dunder Mifflin, a paper company, if you will. Michael is, if you haven't seen it, he's kind of he's the boss of this office that are pretty incompetent people. And it's all worth a watch at least once. You need to watch it. And everyone in the office, he sees them as pretty incompetent, when in fact they're all probably smarter than he is. But he thinks he's the guy. Okay? And in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we saw this model. We saw, it's the CEO model, and I'm the boss, and I lead this team. Surely I need a team of people around me, but I am the boss, and you're the peons. or you do the work that I want done. Okay, I'm very clearly the boss. So it's a hierarchical model, but that's a model that we saw practiced in the 70s and the 80s, called that CEO model. And then then we began to talk about, you really need to develop multi-staff. And so those of us who kind of had the Lone Ranger model, gave up the Lone Ranger model, we adopted this silo, and we developed multiple staff. But when we developed multiple staff, all that meant is we had multiple silos. And what I mean by that is you, as a pastor, I am the pastor of worship, so I handle just worship. And I'm the pastor of children, so I handle children's. And I'm the pastor of assimilation, so I do assimilation. And I'm the pastor of small groups, so I do small groups. And I'm the pastor of youth student ministries. And we all have our silos. And in fact, if you notice, these silos are all very good, self-contained, and there may be one higher one in the middle that may be the lead pastor, if you will. But nonetheless, we're all operating in silos. We're all doing just our thing. And one of my observations is one of the inhibitors of church effectiveness is when we fail to understand what it really means to be a team. A team of highly gifted, and highly competent. I'm not saying one doesn't lead. No, I believe there needs to be leaders. As Tillipal used to say, there needs to be a first among equals, but there's equals. And I think it's very helpful to understand leadership as Paul describes it here, for instance, in Ephesians 4:11 and 12. It was he, that is Christ, who gave some to be apostles, and some to be prophets, and some to be evangelists, and some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attain to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now hear me. There's 20 or so churches mentioned in the New Testament. Okay. The church at Ephesus, we know more about that church than we do any other church, because Paul wrote a letter to Ephesus. It talks about in Acts 18 how he started that church, and in Acts 19 how he visited that church, how he established that church. In Acts 20 he calls the elders together from Ephesus to meet him as he goes off to Jerusalem to be killed, as he thinks. And so a lot is written there. 1st and 2nd Timothy were written. Those letters were written to Timothy as he was the pastor of Ephesus. So some of the issues that Paul deals with in 1st and 2nd Timothy, we know that. And also, by the way, in Revelation, it's one of the 7 churches that are called out for having a problem. Element of ill health, if you will. And it's interesting. We know a lot about the church in Ephesus, but the interesting thing is, I'm very uncomfortable with saying these are the only 5 positions of leadership. You see, and a lot of times we have to be very careful when we say it has to be apostles and prophets and evangelists and shepherds and teachers, because he only wrote this to one church. You see, we don't have those 5 positions mentioned in the other 19 churches that Paul dealt with in the New Testament. I would think if he was working off of just one paradigm, he would have mentioned all 5 of those positions in every church, but he didn't. So I'm not hung up on these 5 or not 5. If they work for you, then use them. But what I am hung up on is Paul very clearly saw that there was a team needed. By the way, in this church in Ephesus, how big was this church? 40, 50 people. It wasn't that big. So don't think that we're talking about large churches have to have teams. Paul is saying here there needs to be some kind of team practiced in leadership. And I love the way that if you look at these giftings of these 5 positions, they're radically different giftings. And I simply use these for illustrative purposes, folks. Again, you don't have different numbers and different gifts and different manifestations in your leadership. That's okay with me. I'm not hung up on that. But I'm just hung up on is one of us doesn't have all the gifts commensurate to lead the church. We need multiple giftings who will lead differently at different times when the needs present themselves. For instance, let me just say quickly that as most of our leaders today, most of our pastors, at least maybe not in the last 5 years, but in the last 40 years of the 20th century, most of our gifted pastors were in the areas of shepherds and teachers. And if you had someone who was apostolic, who loved to start stuff, who loved to go where no one had gone before, the Star Trek kind of thing, they were labeled lack of discipline. We were given all kinds of labels. By the way, Mac Regal is one of these. Mac Regal is probably as close to the apostles you'll find. I don't know how many churches he'd started or been a part of, and he'd start a church and he wouldn't even stay there long enough to get it established. He'd move on, But it was like Paul, who Paul writes Titus. He says, why I left you in Titus 1:5, he says, why I left you in Crete was to clean up the mess I left behind. He literally says that. Read that, Titus 1:5. He said, no, you appoint elders and do all those other kinds of things. But he said, there's a lot of stuff I left unfinished. You see, Paul was an apostolically gifted person. So was Mac. But you see, I heard a lot of criticisms of Mac because he could never stick with something long enough to make it happen. That's because he was gifted that way. You see? And what Mac needed was some other people to come around him to help establish the things that he was starting. And that's the truth of a church. When you look at a church, if you're going to be starting new ministries, if you're going to be starting new life cycles, you need people who can dream and who can be catalytic, who can be apostolic. You need people who are prophets. The prophets were provocateurs. I mean, prophets were, as you know, were butchered and tortured. Why? Because they asked tough questions. They said tough things. And there are prophets today who ask tough questions, who say tough things, and people don't like them. But the reality is the church needs those people because we become better in ministry as a result of it. But they can't be by themselves because a prophet left of their own themselves will be killed. They will. Just like an apostolic person will just run from one thing to another. A prophet will be killed. Evangelists, they'll see all kinds of people come to Christ, but you know what? They never disciple those people. There's a lot of conversions. It's like those Southern Baptists, you know. They just see a lot of people come to Christ. They don't disciple them. Well, you know, the reality is we need a bunch of evangelists, folks. As I said to a seminary professor one time when he was criticizing evangelism because we weren't building disciples, I said, show me one church in the Church of God that has seen so many people come to Christ, they haven't been able to disciple them. You see, we don't have very many of those churches. We don't have very many of those churches. You give me a church with that problem, and I'll help deal with the discipleship. But we need a bunch of evangelists. We do need shepherds and teachers. We do need shepherds and teachers. The reason I believe the shepherds and teachers were the predominant gift mix of pastors in the 60s and the 70s was because we were in a fairly homogeneous society, and we were in a Christian culture. You could talk about Christmas in the classroom. You could even talk about the Ten Commandments. You could talk about the Bible. You could talk about Jesus, all you wanted in the 60s and the 70s in schools. But you know that we no longer live in a Christian culture, and so in a Christian culture, primarily the leadership gifts that you need are shepherds and teachers. Those are the gifts you need because you need someone who will nurture the believers and who will teach them on how to grow up in their faith. But when you begin to invade cross-cultural kinds of ministries where people around the church are no longer Christian, which is where we are today for most of us here in Florida. We're in a post-Christian era. You don't live in a Christian cocoon in all the culture. You need then the apes. That's where all the apes. You need apostles who will start new things, create new ministries. You need prophets who will speak the truth with love. And you need evangelists who will come to Christ, who will see people come to Christ. You need that. Third lid that I see in pastors not effectively fulfilling the call that God has given them, it's a lid, is in fact, I see the pastors are not growing spiritually. You know, one of the strengths of our movement in the 50s and the 60s is the pastors were godly people. The men and women who led the churches were godly people, and they knew it was their passion for Christ that allowed them to fulfill the call of Christ. But something happened as we began to study megachurches and we began to look at leadership and we began to look at a lot of things. People began to emphasize leadership skills at the expense of spiritual heart for God. And we began to worship gifts and skills of a leader of a large church who wrote books and who had significant impact because of leadership skills. And they may have been rotting inside their soul from lack of time alone with the Lord. But you see, we worship the gifts and not the passion for Christ. And one of the things that as I've begun to age myself that I've become frustrated with is there's so many people today in ministry, pastors, men and women, who spend more time developing their leadership skills than their walk with Christ. And that really, really bothers me. Because you see, you don't often see that passion for Christ. They can fake it. They can speak the language. They know how to do it. But I'm telling you, ministry, community transformation occurs as an overflow of your personal walk with Christ. And there are several ways that I see their discipleship kinds of things. And for me, it's interesting. It's almost like people tend toward one extreme or the other. It's just they love Jesus and don't care about leading. Or other people who just spend all the time developing their leadership skills and really don't spend their time with Jesus. But there's a couple things that I've noticed, ways that I can tell as I hang around with pastors. Where is their walk with Christ? And do I hear them talk about their time alone with God? Do I hear them talk about God convicted me of this, or God showed me of this, or God challenged me in this way? Or do I hear them talk about their time in the Word is they've learned things to teach on Sunday, you see, rather than allow God to speak to them personally. But if people are spending time alone with God, they won't be afraid to tell you what God's teaching them. Do they take time for spiritual disciplines? One of the things, if you haven't figured it out already, some of you may think I'm lazy, but I don't start my day in the office until 10 o'clock a.m. Very rare do I show up in the office before 10 o'clock a.m. You could say, well, he's lazy. No, I'm not. I get up most mornings by 6. And I go out and I run. But there's a discipline that I have in the morning, which includes running for me. It includes some other kinds of spiritual disciplines that I practice every day, that if I don't do that, folks, I will never be the leader God has called me to be. And I had a mentor one time early in my ministry tell me, Greg, if someone wants to meet with you in the evening, tell them no, that you'll meet them at 6 in the morning. Well, again, I'm an early morning person. That's not a problem. So I began doing that. And he said, what you'll find is for 80% of the people who want to meet with you in the evening will never meet with you in the morning. And I did that. But we were in a large church, and I began filling up 3, 4, 5 days of my week at 6 o'clock in the morning appointments. And there's a insidious thing began to happen in my life. And I began not having my quiet times anymore. Because the time alone for me was in the morning. And I began to miss that. And I asked that mentor, I said to that mentor, can you tell me, when do you spend time alone with the Lord? And he said, well, Greg, there's some things you have to give up for ministry. Dead serious. He said, you take time in the shower, time in the car, just pray during those times. And something inside of me screamed. And you need to understand that pastor was a pastor of a very large church. All of you would know. And but again, I understand the pressure. But as you watch people under pressure, you find out where their walk with Christ is. How do they treat what I call the little people in their life? How do they treat the cashier? How do they treat the TSA agent? How do they treat the person who works in the gas station behind that glass window? How do they treat people that had no way of benefiting them? Are they kind and compassionate to those people? To me, those are indications of where their personal walk with Christ is. Leadership, for those who just focus on that and never focus on leadership, again, neither extreme is no better than the other. But if I was to fall on one extreme, I would want to fall on my walk with Christ, because that's what will last in eternity. And that's exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3, that there are those whose works will be burned up in fire. Looks good on earth, man. They got a great edifice, but their works will be burned up with fire. That's one of the lids. The one of the lids is that their pastor's not growing spiritually or in the leadership skills. But to be an effective pastor, you have to be growing in both. The fourth one is the pastors are simply too far out front. I see this often in younger pastors. This was demonstrated in my life completely. In fact, my mentor once told me, Greg, a leader is one step ahead, people. A martyr is 5 steps ahead of people. And he said, Greg, more often you're a martyr than a leader. And I know that. And I see that in a lot of younger pastors, that often God's not able to use them effectively in leading because they're so far ahead of the people. Why? Well, it's for a lot of different reasons. One, it's their gifts. There's just a lot of reasons. It may be their impetuousness. It may be a lot of different things. It may be lack of maturity. It may be that they're insecure and they don't want to have to help other people gain the vision, because in helping other people gain the vision, what happens is other people speak into it and the vision may need to change. You see, and they're not willing to allow that to change because they're control freaks. But for whatever reasons, one of the difficulties is pastors are too far out in front of leaders. Next one is pastors have a low EQ. Notice I didn't say IQ. That I see a lot of pastors. EQ, by the way, is emotional intelligence. How smart are you emotionally? And for some reason, it's interesting for me that a lot of guys, men and women, can get into ministry and have low EQs. EQ basically, and there's a great book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. You can buy that if you want to do some research on it. But basically, it's comprised. How do you measure your EQ? It's comprised of 4 things. First of all, is how well do you understand your own emotions? Now you'll see when you hear all these 4 components, you'll say, well, of course you need these in ministry. But I would suggest that you are not able to assess your own EQ. You either need to go and buy this book. It has an online test you can go take. Or you need to have a coach who can help you understand this. But it's impossible for us to understand our own EQs. But how well do you understand your own emotions? When your emotions are brewing inside, how well do you know it? How well are you aware of them? Are you aware of what they're impacting you? Second, how well do you manage your emotions? I don't mean stuff them. I don't mean keep them down. Because God gave us emotions to influence our behavior. We see that in Jesus' life. He was a very emotional person. But he manifested those emotions in appropriate ways and at appropriate times, even as extreme as they may have been at some time. So it's one, how well are you aware of your emotions? The second is, how well do you manage your emotions? The third is, how well do you understand others' emotions? How How sensitive are you to knowing, when you're in the middle of a conversation, is it all about you? Are you really reading what their emotions are? Do you understand what their emotions really are? Obviously, just you can't lead a church unless you're able to at least do these four things. And the last thing is, how well are you able to manage other people's emotions in the context of a relationship? In other words, you don't tell them what to believe, you don't tell them what to feel, you don't tell them it's inappropriate to feel that, but how well are you at not only knowing what they feel, but then able to manage those emotions and help that build in a healthy relationship? The sixth thing is what I call myopic reaching. And myopic reaching is simply this. If you take the passage of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, you find there's 5 types of relationships. 1 Thess 5, 12 to 15. Let me just read it to you. Now we ask you, brothers, and hear me, look and see if you don't see these 5 relationships, 5 kinds of people, in these relationships, in what I'm going to read here. Now we ask you, brothers, to respect those who work hard among you, who are over you in the Lord, and who admonish you. Hold them in highest regard, in love because of their work. Live in peace with each other. And we urge you, brothers, to warn those who are idle, encourage those who are timid, help the weak, be patient with everyone. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always try to be kind to each other and to everybody else. You see, Paul deals with 5 kinds of people. And one of the lids I see in the church is that we forget that there are these 5 kinds of people in every one of our churches. Again, Church of Thessalonica, not a large church here, folks. And he says there's 5 kinds of people as he's writing. He says, as a leader, you need to understand these 5 kinds of people. He says, with those who are VIPs, those are the people who do the work among you. He said, these are very important people. They work hard among you. He says, you need to respect them. He said, there's also those who are timid among you. I call them very teachable people. This is a little bit of what McDonald said years ago. It's changed a little bit. He said, there are those who are timid among you or teachable. They're very teachable among you. He said, what you need to do with those people is you need to encourage them. He says, the VIPs, they're the ones who do the work. They're the ones who do the work. He said, you need to respect them. You need to spend time with them. You need to give them love. So then there's those who are teachable. They're timid. They have the ability to do the work. They're not doing the work yet, but they have the ability. For those, you need to encourage them. You need to teach them. You need to help them grow. Then he said there's VNPs. At one point he says everybody else. He said, what do you do with those? He gives an interesting comment. He says you need to be patient with those people. You see, I would suggest there's a lot of VNPs in our congregations who come to our churches every week. They sit in our pews and they listen to our teachings. They worship. But, and they'll throw a 5 or a 10 spot into the offering, and then they go home. And they're VNPs, very nice people. They sit, they look nice, but they're a pew place. I mean, they just hold a place in the pew. And sometimes it really frustrates us as pastors that, oh man, I wish they'd just get involved in ministry, I wish they'd commit. The reality is, Paul says to those people, you need to be patient. Now, again, as a church planter, I'd have paid to have some VNPs. Just come in VNPs and just come in and sit so it looked like we had a lot more people. But what we find is the larger the church, the larger the facility, the greater the attraction of VNPs. The larger the church, and that's why a lot of these mega churches, we admire the thousands of people that come to mega churches, but the reality is it's just a higher percentage of VNPs, actually, if you look at that. Because VNPs are attracted to a place where they can gain some anonymity. They can just come and sit and be nice. Paul says to be patient with them. Why do we need to be patient with them? I would suggest as you're patient with them, there will come a time in their life, through God's timing, kairos, and his work in their life, they're either a loss of a job, a loss of a spouse, a loss of relationships with sons or daughters, whatever it may be. There'll come a time when there's trauma in their life, and all of a sudden, they will become very teachable people. And that's the time to begin to speak into their life. So the idea that Paul is expressing here is just keep them close. Be patient with them. Let them sit there. Let them be nice. Don't drive them away. Be patient. Paul says there's the next kind of person, and that's what he calls very hurting people. Now, I call them very hurting people. He says those who are weak. He says for those who are weak, he says you need to help them. He says you really need those who are, and the dysfunctional context of our culture. I know we have so many dysfunctional people growing up in homes and relationships. The reality is, because of that, we have a lot of people who are very, very hurting, and they need help. They need counseling. They need all kinds of help that Paul says you need to give them. Well, Paul says there's a 5th kind of person, and I think this is where our myopic reaching often takes place. He says there are those who are VDPs. He calls them idle people, by the way. I call them VDPs, very draining people. He says you warn them. You see, The VIPs, they do the work. The VTPs can be trained to work. The VNPs, they avoid the work. But the VDPs are the work. I mean, they're the people that you've been there. They suck you dry. They're the people that, I don't care, it's at 11, 12 o'clock at night. They're the ones who call you. It's interesting for me, the difference between a very, very hurting people and a very draining person, often they look alike at first glance because they both have a lot of needs. The difference is the VHPs, when you give them help, get better. And I always find the VHPs, as you pour into their life, they become VTPs and they become healthy people. And they always honor your boundaries. VHP will always say, I'm sorry to bother you, but. And it's often, it's an appropriate time. If you say, don't call me after 10 o'clock, they won't call you after 10. VDPs, on their other hand, they wait until 11:30 to call you. And you've been there, you know that. And they will suck you dry. Any energy that you have as a leader will be sucked dry as you give, and they're a black hole. All you hear is, and they just suck it all out of you. And they never get better. They never get better. That's why Paul says, warn them. He says, warn them. And I think, as I talk about myopic reaching, I see a number of our congregations who spend a lot of time because it's very easy to attract VDPs to the congregation. It is. Because they'll come and they'll sit. As long as you continue to give, they'll be there. But the moment you stop giving and they keep sucking, they're gone. VDPs.